The phone line crackled. Static hissed between words, but there was no mistaking the fury in General Omar Bradley's voice. He clenched the receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. On the other end, Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm as ever, delivered an order that would light a fuse under the Allies' already fragile unity. 2 entire American armies, the 1st and the 9th, were to be placed under British command. Not just any British command, Bernard Montgomery. The man American generals had grown to resent, distrust, and in some cases, outright despise. By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. Bradley snarled. Eisenhower didn't flinch. Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation means absolutely nothing. Bradley fell silent, but the damage was done. And in that moment, something snapped. This wasn't just about military tactics. It wasn't about winning the war. It was about who got to win it. About respect, command, pride, and a growing, deep-rooted bitterness aimed squarely at one man. Bernard Law Montgomery, the celebrated British general, hero of El Alamein, darling of Churchill and the British public, had become the most divisive figure in the Allied command, and possibly the most hated man in the US military at the height of World War II. But this wasn't just one clash of egos on a bad day. This was the climax of 3 brutal years of silent resentment, political posturing, and battlefield maneuvering, not just against Hitler, but between allies. And the real question isn't what Montgomery did. It's why the Americans felt so betrayed by him. Because this story isn't about orders and operations. It's about something far deeper, what happens when victory depends on cooperation. But one man refuses to treat his allies as equals. Stay with us, because what you're about to see isn't taught in most history classes. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why the Americans hated Monty. But to understand how the cracks in this alliance first formed, we have to rewind the clock to a battlefield in the Tunisian desert, and an American defeat that would shape everything that came after. The birth of resentment, Tunisia. The 6th of March, 1943. Tunisia. The smell of diesel, dust, and burnt steel drifted across the barren hills. A battered convoy limped toward the front lines, passing twisted wreckage and empty helmets scattered in the sand. The Americans were learning painfully that war in North Africa wasn't a proving ground. It was a crucible, and just days before, they'd been eviscerated in their debut. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had been a disaster. American units, green, undertrained, overconfident, had crumbled under the pressure of veteran German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The legendary Desert Fox hadn't just beaten them, he'd embarrassed them. One commander, witnessing the collapse firsthand, wrote simply, "We were not prepared for this kind of war." And the British noticed. The defeat produced more than casualties. It gave British high command exactly what they had feared and secretly expected. Proof that the American army wasn't ready. And for men like General Harold Alexander, commander of the Allied forces in Tunisia, it sparked a dangerous shift from friendship to oversight. His official report on US performance didn't mince words. Lacked combat experience. Chaotic command structure. Insufficient discipline. To Alexander and his British staff, the message was clear. Letting the Americans run their own show was simply too risky. They weren't ready, and they'd need the British to show them how it was done. A bitter pill, made more bitter by the man who had just arrived to turn things around. Enter General George S. Patton. He stepped off the plane like a general from another era, polished boots, ivory-handled sidearm, and the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't do excuses. His first assignment? Rebuild the battered US. 2 corps into a fighting force. And, just as crucially, redeem the American name in British eyes. But Patton wasn't just fighting Germans. He was fighting perception, the British assumption. From his first day on the ground, Patton was confronted with British officers whose attitudes weren't malicious, but they were dismissive. They didn't say the Americans needed babysitting. They didn't say that US troops were little more than auxiliaries. They didn't need to. It was in every detail. Orders were filtered through British-composed plans. American movements were suggested with British priorities in mind. And any attempt to operate independently was quietly redirected back to a support role. Even British coordination teams used misleading language. US forces weren't leading attacks, they were supporting the main push. The implication was subtle, but the effect was massive. To British commanders, it was field strategy. To Patton, it was a reminder that Americans were not trusted. His personal diary entries from that week were sharp and venomous. We're being treated like second-rate colonials. Alexander sees us as useful, but not necessary. Montgomery arrives, and the divide sharpens. Meanwhile, from the other end of the desert, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was making his move. Monty had spent months clawing his way across North Africa, earning praise for beating Rommel at El Alamein, a much-needed victory, after early British defeats had undermined public morale. But to Americans, Montgomery didn't arrive as a humble partner. He arrived as a hero, and worse, he knew it. His men respected him, adored him, even because he was cautious, thorough, and didn't waste lives recklessly. But his manner, it grated immediately. He spoke to Allied commanders like he was the adult in the room. To US officers, it wasn't just arrogance. It was a subtle colonial smugness, wrapped in lectures, precision, and phrases like, "your boys" and "our war." Americans weren't equals. They were enthusiastic amateurs being ushered along by British wisdom. And Montgomery lived that belief operationally, politically, and even symbolically. In maps, American sectors were drawn smaller. In reports, US contributions were underplayed. In briefings, American success was repackaged as British coordination. So when final plans for the Tunisia campaign were announced, with Montgomery and the British 8th Army taking the main assault, and Patton's forces tasked with a supporting role, the frustration turned white hot. Again, the Americans would fight, but the British would win. Operation proved them wrong. Patton wasn't about to let his army be sidelined twice. On March 17th, 1943, he launched a sharp offensive toward El-Gaitar, a bold move designed not just to hit German positions, but to prove something deeper. American arms belonged on the front line, not beside it. 7 days later, the proof came. The 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's most dangerous armored units, surged forward in a pre-dawn attack, expecting the usual chaos from US defenders. Instead, they ran into lethal precision. US artillery laid down carefully calculated fields of fire. Tank destroyers struck German armor at ideal angles and range. American infantry held the line even as smoke and steel tore through the valley. By sundown, the battlefield was littered with wreckage. The Germans had been stopped cold. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't pretty. But for the first time in the war, American ground forces had held and defeated elite German armor in open battle. And back at headquarters, silence. No headlines, no press releases, no British commendation. Montgomery's assault on the Meerut line, meanwhile, stole the spotlight, even though it had stalled in the first phase and required modification mid-operation. To American eyes, it wasn't just unfair, it was deliberate. Let the British win while the Americans bleed quietly. Micromanagement and mistrust. Then came the next slap. As Patton's corps kept advancing, shifting German reserves and capturing key terrain, British command began changing orders mid-operation. Stop here. Now advance there. Swap units. Change objectives. Halt armor. Lead with infantry. These whiplash orders didn't follow broader strategy, they served Montgomery's timeline. Whenever 8th Army stumbled, 2nd Corps would be paused or diverted, providing cover or distraction at politically convenient times, without regard for tactical momentum. Patton saw straight through it. He wrote, "Our movements are no longer tied to the enemy. They're tied to Montgomery's feelings." Yet he obeyed. Too much was at stake. He swallowed orders, absorbed insults, and pushed forward because defeat would only prove the British right. Victory denied. By late March, both armies had pushed through. American units had cleared key valleys, disrupted German logistics, and pinned down defenders during Montgomery's flank shift, a critical piece of the final success. But when the campaign ended, British units led the parade. Montgomery was interviewed by the press, and US commanders received a nod, nothing more. Even General Eisenhower, under political pressure to maintain unity, soft-pedaled credit to American units in official communiques. It felt like erasure. One officer, watching the parade in Tunis, muttered, "If you listen to the Brits, we crossed the ocean just to give them someone to boss around." The seeds take root. By the time the Tunisia campaign ended, American views of Montgomery had crystallized, and not in his favor. The stereotype was already forming in hushed officer conversations and handwritten letters home. Monty plays for Monty. He captures the credit, not the objective. He doesn't command allies, he tolerates them. To Montgomery's defenders, this perception was unfair. After all, he had delivered victories. He had been cautious enough to reduce casualties. His style was different, yes, but not disloyal. To his American counterparts, those points didn't matter. Because even if Montgomery didn't mean to offend or belittle his allies, he never once acted like they mattered, and that more than any one tactical disagreement became the problem. And if Montgomery's pride strained the alliance in Tunisia, it would nearly break it one island later, when the Americans tried to storm Sicily and once again found themselves fighting for victory while Montgomery fought for the spotlight. Support Act, Operation Husky, July 10th, 1943, Gulf of Gala, Sicily. The waves were brutal. Wind whipped salt water into the faces of young American soldiers clutching their rifles, staring into total darkness. Behind them, more than 3,000 ships creaked and groaned, the largest amphibious assault force in history to that point. Ahead of them, unknown terrain, coastal guns, and Axis positions hidden in the hills. Operation Husky had begun, but while the landing force was unified in purpose, the command planning behind it was anything but. Because behind every choice, every landing zone, every mission, every objective, there was a quiet argument between allies that never really stopped. And once again, in the middle of it stood Bernard Montgomery. The debate that shaped the invasion, from the beginning, Husky had been contentious. Initial plans proposed multiple landings across the entire island of Sicily. The idea, seize key ports early, divide Axis forces, and allow the Allies to move rapidly inland from multiple directions. Sound strategy, at least on paper. But Montgomery, he was having none of it. Drawing on his experience in North Africa, he was adamant. Dispersed forces meant defeat. Concentration was strength. He demanded a narrow landing sector focused entirely on southeastern Sicily. That way, his 8th Army could strike directly for Messina, the key port city and gateway to mainland Italy. And if that meant American forces had to adjust their landings and limit their objectives, so be it. He pushed his plan with unusual aggression, even threatening to resign if the war planners didn't adopt it. Churchill backed him. And when Montgomery brought the matter to Eisenhower's desk, the Supreme Commander did something American commanders would quietly seethe about for months. He said yes, compromise at a cost. On May 2nd, 1943, Eisenhower made it official. All Allied landings would now converge in the southeast corner of Sicily. Montgomery's 8th Army would drive north along the island's eastern coast directly toward Messina. Patton's American 7th Army would land on the western flank with the primary task of protecting Montgomery's advance. That word again, support. Another plan, another operation, another American force in a leading role on paper. But Montgomery, yet again, had reshaped Allied strategy into something that served his goals, his army, and his glory. And back in North Africa, reading the final plans, Patton was furious. His diary from that week captured the mood perfectly. What fools we are! Alexander, the British commander, arrives without a single American officer on his staff, and we pretend we're partners. To Patton, this wasn't just logistics. It was symbolic warfare, the slow, humiliating marginalization of American power in a war being fought with their soldiers, their ships, their fuel, and their factories. The landings. Victory in the shadows. Despite Montgomery's plan, the landings on July 10th went surprisingly well, at least by World War II standards. Waves of aircraft dropped British and American paratroopers across Sicily, though many were scattered wildly due to nighttime confusion, strong winds, and friendly fire from spooked Allied gunners. Those who survived the drop or the ocean fought ferociously to regroup with their units and attack key positions. Meanwhile, on the beaches at Gela, Licata, and Skogliti, American infantry waded through crashing surf under fire. They met stiff Axis resistance, not from Italians, who largely surrendered, but from veteran German paratroopers. The fighting was especially intense at Gela, where American tanks and German panzers literally slugged it out within sight of the waterline. But by dusk, the lines held. The beachheads were secure. The Americans had done their part again. And just as in Tunisia, they were assigned to wait, because Montgomery believed the Germans would collapse quickly under his methodical advance. He didn't need the Americans to take ground, he needed them to guard his flank. The plan collapses. Then came the problem. The Germans weren't collapsing. In fact, they were doing the opposite. Up near the coastal town of Catania, German units dug into the rocky terrain around Mount Etna, natural high ground that made direct attacks nearly suicidal. Monty's advance stalled. His slow, calculated method clashed with limited mobility, miserable terrain, and an enemy that refused to move. And in response, Montgomery did something that would fracture Allied trust for the rest of the war. He moved the goalposts again. In a message to General Alexander, Montgomery unilaterally declared that he would now expand the British zone of operations, appropriating a road and sector previously assigned to Patton's 7th Army. Patton's forces, they were to halt, defend, and get out of the way. This wasn't a proposal. It was an order. Montgomery hadn't even consulted American leadership. He simply assumed compliance. And Alexander agreed. Patton pushes back. This was the final straw. Patton's response, though carefully worded in official channels, was clear. If British commanders wouldn't assign his army a primary objective, he'd go find one himself. On July 17th, he proposed a bold plan to Alexander. Let the Americans drive northwest. Take Palermo, Sicily's capital and main port. Cut the island in half. Trap Axis forces. Open a new supply line. And then, possibly, turn east and race Montgomery to Messina. Alexander okayed it. Suddenly, the race was on even if no one officially called it that. The American breakout, what happened next, stunned everyone, including Montgomery. With minimal political friction slowing them down, Patton's 7th Army moved like lightning. Infantry divisions marched over mountains through intense July heat with little rest. Engineers built bridge after bridge across rivers and broken terrain. Armor units flanked Axis positions in hours instead of days. Palermo fell on July 22nd, just 12 days after Patton's army had landed. By early August, Patton had turned east, pushing along Sicily's northern coast toward Messina. The terrain was brutal, resistance stiff, but the Americans, driven by pride and purpose, moved fast. Meanwhile, Montgomery's 8th Army was still grinding through German defenses below Mount Etna, slowly. The personality is the point. Make no mistake, this wasn't just two armies navigating different terrain. This was two worldviews, two leadership styles, and two egos colliding under pressure. Montgomery valued caution, preparation, reduced casualties. Patton prized momentum, aggression, and spectacle. To Montgomery, racing to Messina was meaningless, a sideshow. Surely, Patton had only succeeded because he faced Italians, not Germans. To Patton, the entire point was to prove him wrong. He acts like the war runs through his tent, Patton wrote of Montgomery. Time to run it through ours instead. The finish line and the fallout. On August 17th, 1,943, elements of Patton's 3rd Division entered Messina just hours ahead of the British. If it had been a victory parade, the Americans won it. But it didn't feel like a win. Not really. The British cables went out first, emphasizing the toughness of German positions 8th Army had faced. American efforts were acknowledged briefly. Montgomery publicly praised Patton, while subtly reminding everyone that his front had been more difficult. The anger that wouldn't go away. 2 seemingly minor incidents during the Sicily campaign hardened American resentment and would never be forgotten. The liaison officer insult. Patton had sent Montgomery a full US team for inter-allied coordination, senior officers, communications gear, the works. Montgomery sent back a single, disheveled lieutenant with a suitcase tied with string. Patton sent him back. The slapping scandal. Patton, during field hospital inspections, slapped 2 shell-shocked soldiers he accused of cowardice. The incident leaked. Montgomery's response was cold and clinical. A British officer would never behave so poorly. To many Americans, the implication was clear. Montgomery didn't just distrust their skills, he questioned their character. Sicily changed everything. By the time Sicily was fully in Allied hands, the American perception of Montgomery wasn't just sour, it had curdled. Yes, he was effective. Yes, he was clever. But he was also calculated, condescending, and completely uninterested in giving the Americans equal footing on the battlefield they were helping to win. And worst of all, he believed he was right. But Sicily wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Because soon, partnership would turn into outright rivalry. And the next battlefield wouldn't just be about maps and missions, it would be about who got to Berlin first. The race to Messina, rivalry becomes war. Mid-July 1943, Sicily. 2 armies advanced across the rugged island, separated by mountains and by something far more dangerous than German machine guns. Ego. This wasn't just about terrain or tactics anymore. It was personal. On one side, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Methodical, precise, tactically brilliant. Backed by Churchill, beloved by his troops, and certain that his army and his plan were the keys to victory. On the other, General George S. Patton, bold, impulsive, obsessed with proving that American forces could not only keep up with the British, they could beat them. And their target? A port city near the northeastern tip of Sicily, Messina. The mission and the meaning. Montgomery's mission was clear. Advance up Sicily's eastern coastline, press through Catania, and seize Messina, cutting off Axis evacuation routes and clearing the path to mainland Italy. Patton's official mission? Guard Montgomery's flank. But Patton had other plans. He believed Montgomery was dragging his feet, too cautious, too slow. His own army had just captured Palermo in record time. Morale was high, lines were moving, the enemy was faltering. If Montgomery wasn't going to win Sicily quickly, Patton would, and just like that, the campaign shifted from alliance to competition. 2 roads to glory. Geographically, the campaign had turned into a textbook pincer movement. Montgomery, with the British 8th Army, climbing the East Coast. Patton, with the American 7th Army, advancing along the North Coast. Both aiming for Messina, and both determined to get there first. But terrain alone couldn't explain what happened next. Because this wasn't a race forced by the enemy. It was a race created by the Allies. The prize wasn't just the port, it was prestige. Whoever entered Messina first would claim Sicily as their victory, their crown jewel, and would define how the next stage of the war and the post-war world was remembered. Patton on the attack. From the moment he got Alexander's reluctant approval to launch his own offensive, Patton pressed the gas pedal and never let up. He wasn't just advancing, he was racing. Orders to his corps commanders were direct, even obsessive. Move fast, lead from the front, no excuses. His staff barely had time to keep up. Engineers built and rebuilt bridges under fire. Infantry endured triple-digit heat, marching up mountainous roads with fading rations and few breaks. At every junction, Patton sent newer units to keep pressing, while bloodied divisions rested briefly before being rotated back in. His forces never stopped moving except when blocked by sheer force of nature or stubborn German rearguards. And even then, it wasn't for long. Montgomery's mindset. Meanwhile, Montgomery's advance was slower, but not without reason. His 8th Army was facing elite German units, including the Hermann Göring Division, entrenched around the foothills of Mount Etna. The terrain was narrow, defensible, and deadly. Progress was measured in infantry casualties and cleared pillboxes. To Monty, the American operation was clever, sure, but also convenient. He saw Patton's drive not as strategic genius, but as opportunism. Patton had sprinted through easier terrain against weaker Italian opposition, and now acted like he was conquering Rome. In Monty's eyes, real warfare, competent warfare, was what his soldiers were doing, methodically grinding through professionally entrenched German lines. And if that meant he'd arrive in Messina second, so be it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The undeniable clash. Culture versus culture. By late July, the divide between the two commanders had become more than just directional. It was cultural and deeply symbolic. Montgomery's 8th Army. Cautious, calculating, limited casualties, security over speed, tactical victories that protected lives, not headlines. Patton's 7th Army. Aggressive, unrelenting, risk over caution, spectacle in style, public morale fueled by showmanship. The British, seasoned by 4 years of bloodshed and strategic exhaustion, couldn't afford unnecessary losses. They had to win smart and slow. The Americans, new to the European war, but rich in manpower and confidence, were ready to push harder, faster, and with a chip on their shoulder a mile wide. And at the center of both philosophies stood Montgomery and Patton. Two egos, two brands, and no middle ground. Media and morale. As both generals advanced on Messina, the American press picked up on the tension with headlines quietly fueling the race. US newspapers hinted at a dramatic dash for victory. Rumors flew of a friendly rivalry between Anglo and American forces. But there was nothing friendly about it. Not to Patton, not to Montgomery, because this wasn't a sideshow. This was a battle for narrative. Montgomery's supporters were already preparing victory speeches. British newspapers had pre-written feature stories waiting to applaud his brilliant campaign across Sicily. Patton knew that if American forces arrived a day too late, all their success would be erased. They'd be written out again. Not this time. Tempers flare. The slapping scandal. And then, just as Patton's campaign was hitting top gear, disaster struck. But not from the Germans, from Patton himself. In 2 separate incidents, on August 3rd and August 10th, Patton slapped soldiers in military hospitals who had been admitted for battle fatigue. He accused them of cowardice. One soldier he even threatened at gunpoint. When word got out, it triggered a political firestorm. Eisenhower was livid. Washington bristled at the reports. Calls for Patton's removal rang through the Pentagon. Allied morale was at risk, and Montgomery now had a golden opportunity to gloat, to lecture, to condemn. But his response was colder than expected. A British commander, he reportedly told staff, would never behave that way. We are trained not to lose control. The comment was meant to signal discipline and professionalism. To Americans, it sounded like a slap of its own. Another British judgment. Another lecture. Another clear example that Montgomery didn't just question American tactics, but American character. The liaison insult. Adding fuel to the fire, Montgomery had sent Patton a liaison officer, a key figure meant to coordinate operations and maintain Allied cohesion. But instead of sending a senior officer with communications gear and strategic briefing experience, Monty sent a junior lieutenant with a suitcase tied together by string. Patton viewed the act as outright mockery. He had sent Montgomery a full liaison team, including a colonel, a major, and advanced signal equipment. In exchange, he received a fresh-faced boy with a single bag and no apology. Patton sent him back with a note. "I cannot permit boys in this headquarters." The message wasn't about the cloth or the rank. It was about respect, or the complete lack thereof. The final push. By mid-August, the Americans were just 8 miles from Messina. But so was Montgomery. The roads were wrecked. The Germans were retreating in good order. and intelligence reports made clear that the Wehrmacht was executing a massive evacuation toward mainland Italy, buying time, evacuating troops, and destroying everything behind them. Patton didn't care. He was obsessed with getting to Messina first, and getting there fast. Bridges were rebuilt in hours, not days. Engineers pulled double and triple shifts. Artillery was leapfrogged ahead before supplies even arrived. In every briefing, Patton hammered the same phrase: victory goes to the boldest. And then, on August 17th, 1943, it happened. American troops rolled into Messina, hours before Montgomery's forces arrived. A hollow win? The pictures were perfect. American flags waving. Local crowds cheering. Columns of beaten Axis prisoners being marched through the streets. Victory in Sicily now had a face, and it was American. But behind the celebration, there was silence. British press downplayed the speed of Patton's campaign. Montgomery issued a dry, quiet congratulations, then pivoted immediately to the difficulties his own army overcame. It wasn't bitterness. It was something worse. Dismissal. Montgomery implied the Americans had moved fast because they faced no real opposition, that his troops had done the real fighting, that the race never really mattered because it was a performance, not a campaign. Patton never forgot it. Neither did Eisenhower, nor Omar Bradley. The real battle. By the time the Sicily campaign ended, it was clear the battle between Montgomery and his American counterparts wasn't about orders or maps or missions. It was about validation. The Americans had proven themselves again. They had won again, but they weren't being acknowledged. Montgomery's tactical brilliance? Undeniable. But his inability or refusal to treat American forces as equals left a stench that wouldn't wash off. In many ways, the race to Messina wasn't about Sicily at all. It was about who would get to say, "We won this war." The disaster of Market Garden, when ego cost lives. September 1944. Germany was on the run. After the brutal slog of Normandy, Allied forces had finally broken out. Paris had been liberated. German troops were retreating in chaos. Morale was high. Victory felt near. The war might, just maybe, be over by Christmas. But to one man, this wasn't good enough. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, fresh off promotions, riding on political capital, and firmly entrenched as Britain's battlefield icon, saw an opportunity. A shortcut, a gamble that, if successful, would end the war in weeks. Operation Market Garden. And this time, Montgomery wasn't asking permission. He was demanding priority at everyone else's expense. The pitch. One big punch. Montgomery's proposal was bold on paper, even brilliant. Instead of slowly pushing across the entire German border, the broad front approach favored by American leadership, Monty wanted to do something else. Concentrate everything into one massive strike through the Netherlands. Here's how it would work. US and British paratroopers would be dropped deep behind enemy lines to seize key bridges. Meanwhile, British ground forces would drive up a single highway from Belgium to link up with them. They'd cross the Rhine, push into the Ruhr, the heart of German industry, and punch a hole straight toward Berlin. Montgomery insisted this concentrated thrust would avoid months of drawn-out fighting on the German frontier. He called it a dagger to the heart of the enemy. The pitch was dramatic, strategically risky, politically explosive, because it came with a cost. Redirect the fuel, starve the Americans. To make Market Garden happen, Eisenhower had to do one thing Montgomery knew the Americans would hate. Shift resources, including fuel and supplies, away from Patton and Bradley, whose armies were already advancing rapidly toward Germany. Monty needed supply priority, and he got it. Eisenhower, wanting to maintain Allied unity and give Britain a decisive headline, gave the green light. Patton's tanks stalled, Bradley's advances slowed, punches that were landing were pulled back. All so Montgomery could have his moment. To American commanders, the message was undeniable. They were once again supporting the British plan. Again, British forces would get the glory. Again, success would be painted in London's colors, not Washington's. Bradley was incensed. Patton was borderline mutinous. "We've broken through everywhere," Patton snarled. "But we can't move because our gas is going north for Monty's plan." The 17th of September, 1944, the drop begins. Operation Market Garden launched with more than 35,000 airborne troops dropped into the Netherlands. 3 divisions, the US, 101st, 82nd, and the British 1st Airborne, hit the ground to seize bridges over a 64-mile corridor. It was one of the largest airborne operations in history, and it began falling apart almost immediately. The cracks show bad intel, long odds. Before the first plane even took off, American intelligence had warned of German armored units near Arnhem, the critical northernmost bridge. Montgomery dismissed the reports. Commanders on the ground were concerned, but Monty's staff insisted enemy resistance would be light. Instead, what they faced were elite SS Panzer units, recoiling from earlier battles, now regrouping just miles from the drop zones. To make matters worse, the drop zones were miles away from the bridges, giving the Germans time to reinforce. The entire ground advance was dependent on one single elevated highway, impossible to flank and vulnerable to the smallest delay. If anything slowed the column, the entire operation could collapse. The highway to hell, the British Corps tasked with linking up to the airborne troops began pushing north. Almost immediately, they hit trouble. Roads packed with refugees, mines and demolished bridges, narrow causeways that turned tanks into sitting ducks. The Allies would later call it Hell's Highway. Stretched thin, without room to maneuver, British armor crawled from town to town, while German troops used the surrounding marshland to harass, delay, and flank them at every turn. And ahead, in Arnhem, British paratroopers held one end of the critical bridge, but were cut off, outmanned, and soon out of ammunition. No one came. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, holding the Arnhem Bridge with his dwindling unit, radioed, "Out of ammo. God save the king." Market Garden fails. By September 25th, the operation was officially abandoned. Arnhem was lost. Over 17,000 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Montgomery's dagger to Berlin had turned into a disaster. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The Germans, thought to be collapsing, had instead won their most significant defensive victory since Normandy. And the war that might have ended by Christmas now slid toward another hard winter. Montgomery rewrites history, but Monty wasn't interested in failure. Shortly after the operation collapsed, he held a press conference and delivered his verdict. The operation was 90% successful. He boasted that most objectives had been reached, that large portions of Holland had been liberated, that the bridges had mostly been taken. Only Arnhem, he claimed, had failed a minor setback in an otherwise great success. The Americans were stunned. Patton exploded. 90% successful? What kind of math is that for a battle we just lost outright? Bradley, known for his calm, was furious. He had opposed Market Garden from the start. Montgomery had gotten the priority, the supplies, the green light, and now he was rewriting history. Not only had the operation dragged thousands of troops into disaster, but Montgomery was claiming credit for what was a costly failure. A reputation protected at any cost. This became the moment American commanders understood the full measure of Montgomery. He wasn't just blunt. He wasn't just arrogant. He was untouchable, at least in British circles. Every success belonged to him. Every failure was someone else's fault. The plan was good, execution flawed, support underwhelming, resources insufficient. US forces hadn't pushed fast enough. The Germans were unexpectedly strong despite warnings. But what Montgomery never did was this: say, "I was wrong." And for his American counterparts, that was the deepest cut of all. Trust fractures. From that moment, trust was gone. Eisenhower, who had offered Montgomery every accommodation, now quietly began limiting his authority. Bradley said publicly that Montgomery was unfit for coalition command. Patton, predictably, launched into him in private tam. But this time, he had support. The American generals now saw Montgomery not just as arrogant, not just as difficult, but as dangerous. Ambition over alliance. Market Garden wasn't just a failed operation. It was a moment where Montgomery's self-interest, his hunger for glory, image, and control was placed ahead of coalition, cohesion. He had demanded priority in a global war. He had sidelined American advances. He had gambled with Allied lives. And then he told the world it was a win. It wasn't. And the cost? Over 17,000 casualties, months of stalled momentum, and an alliance on the verge of implosion. And just when the Americans thought Monty couldn't do more damage, he held a new press conference, this time taking credit for one of their hardest fought battles, a battle barely won in the snow and forest, a battle called the Bulge. I saved them, the press conference that nearly ended the alliance. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. It happened without warning. At exactly 5:30 a.m., German artillery erupted across the snowy landscape. Within minutes, 3 entire panzer armies surged through fog and pine, smashing into thinly held segments of the American line. The Allied command was unprepared, scattered, and momentarily stunned. Hitler had launched a desperate, last-ditch offensive. The goal? Split the Allied front in two, race to the port of Antwerp, cut off supply lines, and force a negotiated peace. It was a long shot, a military gamble fit for a dictator with no cards left. But for 10 days, it worked. American forces were caught off guard. Entire battalions were encircled. Communications collapsed. Roads choked with snowy traffic jams and shell-shock survivors trying to fall back. German tanks crushed forward through villages whose names no American had ever heard street. Vith, Clairvaux, Wiltz, but would never forget. And sitting on the sidelines until now was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. This would be one of his most shining moments, militarily, and also his most disgraceful act politically. Bulge. Chaos at the front, panic at HQ. The attack, eventually named the Battle of the Bulge, was the largest German offensive on the Western Front. 2 American armies, the 1st and the 9th, bore the full weight. Entire divisions were surrounded or decimated. Commanders were operating without maps, without air support, and without a clear picture of who still held what. German tanks, disguised SS units, and blizzard conditions turned the forests of Belgium into a hellscape. And Eisenhower, sitting at Supreme Headquarters, made a desperate decision. He temporarily reassigned both the 1st and 9th US armies to British command, to Montgomery. It made operational sense. The forces were north of the Bulge. British reserves were already in the area. Montgomery could react faster, plug gaps, form a counterattack, and tactically, Montgomery delivered. Monty at his best. To his credit, Montgomery's military response was brilliant. He immediately organized the chaos into named corridors and sectors. He ordered British forces forward to defend the Meuse River crossings, anticipating the German direction of attack. He worked closely with battered American commanders, coordinated artillery, and halted German momentum in the north. His staff were composed, his planning clinical. Monty did what he was often best at tidying up a disaster. And from a purely battlefield perspective, he deserved credit. But then he opened his mouth to the press. January 7th, 1,945 amperes. Microphone, a knife. With German forces now in retreat, momentum shifting back to the Allies, Field Marshal Montgomery called a press conference to update the public. American troops had held against one of the most aggressive Axis offensives of the entire war. They had fought, adapted, and bled in the snow. Patton's Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees to the north in freezing weather to relieve the trapped defenders of Bastogne. This was, by every measure, a remarkable demonstration of American resilience under fire. But in front of rows of journalists, British and American, Montgomery took the stage and gave one of the most self-promoting, backhanded, incendiary briefings of the war. Here's what he said. "As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. He described the battlefield as untidy, praised himself for tidying it up, and repeatedly emphasized that British leadership had imposed order where chaos reigned. Oh, he mentioned the Americans. He thanked the troops for their fighting qualities, but not once did he give substantive credit to American commanders. Not to Bradley, not to Eisenhower, not to Patton. Instead, Montgomery made it sound like he had saved the Americans from disaster and that the victory was his. The stunned press sat in silence. Then, the questions started mostly from American correspondents. And Montgomery doubled down. This was a most interesting and tricky battle, possibly the most interesting I have ever handled. The fallout anger erupts. It didn't take long for the transcript to reach US command. And when it did, the reaction was fast and volcanic. General Omar Bradley, who had temporarily lost 2 of his armies to Montgomery's command, was livid. His response to Eisenhower was blistering. If Monty is to have continued command over our forces, then you'll have to accept my resignation. That wasn't bluster. Bradley, known for his quiet demeanor and political dexterity, had had enough. Montgomery had belittled American command after Americans had saved the entire front. The 101st at Bastogne had held out surrounded for days, freezing, low on ammo, refusing to surrender. Patton's Third Army had made a bold maneuver, breaking the siege. Countless Americans had died in the snow, and now Monty was standing on their ice-covered bodies to raise his flag. Crisis at the top. Eisenhower, finally, had reached his limit. Privately, he drafted a message to the combined chiefs of staff in London and DC. Unless Montgomery issues an apology and refrains from any future public criticism of Allied strategy, I will request his relief from duty. It was the strongest stance Eisenhower had ever taken against the British Golden Boy. Montgomery would not be allowed to fracture the alliance from within. The war wasn't over, but for the Americans, the trust was. The apology that changed nothing. 10 days later, Montgomery finally responded. He sent Eisenhower a letter, regret for the misunderstanding, stated he intended to honor American contributions, politely acknowledged that his tone had caused unintended offense. He sent another note to Bradley, flattering in tone, handwritten and layered with diplomatic niceties. But it came too late. The damage was permanent. Bradley remained furious. Patton referred to Montgomery, from that day forward, as only that pious little strid. Even Eisenhower, who had spent the entire war trying to hold the alliance together, fully accepted that Montgomery's ego was now more destructive than the German war machine. The question was no longer how great a general Montgomery was. It was whether his faults were worth the disruption he caused. And for most of the American high command, the answer was finally, undeniably, no. The real battle wasn't in the snow. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as a hard-earned American victory. 600,000 U.S. troops involved. 19,000 killed. Dozens of units thrown from rest into emergency combat. Heroes made in every foxhole. But ask any American general what stuck with them most afterward. Not just the fight. What burned deepest was Montgomery stepping forward after the dust settled and placing the British flag squarely on top of their sacrifice. But even after Montgomery stepped off the stage, even after the Bulge was over, the alliance continued to unravel. Because soon, Montgomery would be sidelined, not by orders, but by irrelevance. The Americans didn't need him anymore. And when the final victory came, it didn't come flying a Union Jack. The final humiliation. How Montgomery got sidelined for good. Early 1945, Western Europe. The snow was melting. The German army was breaking. And the war, after 6 long years, was entering its final crushing stage. But as the Allies prepared for their closing strike, a quiet shift had taken over the command structure one Montgomery had seen coming. One he feared more than any German counterattack. Because by now, the future of the war wasn't British. It was American. And Montgomery was about to be forced to watch from a distance as history moved on without him. The hard numbers nobody could ignore. By spring 1945, the shift in Allied military power was undeniable. The United States now had more than 65 divisions operating in Europe. The British and Canadians, once co-leaders, fielded fewer than 20. American air power dominated the skies. American factories supplied the weapons. American logistics kept the armies moving. In every strategic conference, in every supply chain, in every command map, the road pointed to Washington, not London. Montgomery, for all his battlefield brilliance, could no longer pretend otherwise. His war and his authority were shrinking. A command reduced. Following the events of the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower made his judgment clear. Montgomery would not be given supreme operational command again. Instead, the Field Marshal would remain in charge of his 21st Army Group, commanding British and Canadian forces operating in Northern Europe. A respectable role, but no longer a central one. Monty had gone from commanding the entire Normandy ground campaign to directing a supporting theater, far from the headlines, away from the decisive blows. And though he still held rank, prestige, and recognition in Britain, the Americans, including Eisenhower himself, had lost trust in his judgment permanently. He would never again control American armies. Not on paper, not in practice, not even for a day. One Allied commander put it bluntly, Montgomery still spoke as though he led the war, but no one listened anymore. His operations became sound, but small. To his credit, Montgomery continued conducting military operations professionally. In the final push through the Low Countries, he led his forces across the Rhine with a well-executed assault known as Operation Plunder. It was meticulous, efficient, and technically impressive. But it was overshadowed entirely by American river crossings to the south. Patton's army had already raced across the Rhine days earlier at Oppenheim, using captured bridges and improvisation in classic American style. Monty's crossing came later, slower, and less urgently. His operational skill was still there, but the theater had changed. The Americans had adopted the momentum, the initiative, and the headlines. Montgomery's force was now part of the larger machine, not its driving engine. Silence speaks loudest. Perhaps the clearest sign that Montgomery's influence had evaporated? No one was talking about him anymore. In the war's closing months, he stopped appearing in Eisenhower's strategic briefings. He was left out of political communiques to Washington. Even Churchill, once his most vocal advocate, began focusing attention on diplomatic efforts with FDR and Stalin. Montgomery had gone from being the face of British battlefield success to being a technical detail in the American march to victory. And nobody was going to stop it, because quite simply, the war was now being won without him. Med 1945 victory, but not his. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Celebrations erupted across America, Britain, France, and every free corner of the continent. Commanders were toasted, parades planned, legacies secured. Montgomery held his own ceremony in the north, accepting the formal surrender of German forces facing his army group. It was a proud moment broadcast back to Britain, framed in newspapers as Monty's curtain call. But in Washington and Paris, the spotlight was elsewhere. Eisenhower was pictured at the global Allied victory parade. Bradley and Patton were given full honors on their return. Montgomery's name appeared in footnotes and off camera. He had helped win the war, but he hadn't ended it. And in the most symbolically painful twist of all, the final decisive campaign, the capture of the heart of Germany, had belonged entirely to American armies. Berlin fell to the Soviets. The Rhine was beaten by Patton and Bradley. Victory arrived with stars and stripes, not the Union Jack. The war after the war history, retold. If Montgomery's voice had faded during the war's final months, it roared back after it ended. Because in 1958, over a decade after victory, Montgomery published his war memoirs. And in those pages were all the old problems resurrected in ink. He questioned Eisenhower's strategic decisions. He claimed his own plans, had they been followed, would have ended the war sooner. He minimized Market Garden's flaws. He indirectly blamed others, including Americans, for stalls and losses. The book read not like reflection, but like revenge. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, was so disgusted he cut off all contact with Montgomery and never resumed it. Bradley, in his own memoir, called Montgomery a liability to the alliance, one who never understood coalition warfare. Patton's posthumously published diaries were even harsher. What had once been battlefield tension became historical, scorched earth. Monty hadn't just lost trust, he'd lost legacy. Britain steps back. Montgomery's sidelining wasn't personal. It was symbolic, because just as Monty was fading from Allied relevance, so too was British military power. Britain had fought valiantly, but it was finishing the war, exhausted, broke, and on the verge of imperial collapse. The US had resources, manpower, and emerging global dominance. Montgomery's inability or unwillingness to yield control reflected something deeply British: the reluctance to accept that the old empire no longer called the shots. One British officer later stated, "Monty wasn't just a field commander, he was Britain trying to remind the world it still mattered, but no amount of conviction could change the reality." America had taken the lead, not just in strategy, but in power itself. So why was he still respected in Britain? Despite everything, Montgomery remained asterisk, and still remains asterisk, a British national hero. He represented a moment where the country fought back against Nazi aggression. He stabilized the battlefield when it was disintegrating. He gave the public confidence when confidence was in short supply. But to the Americans, he represented something very different. A talented general who refused to recognize shared effort. A man who hoarded credit, blamed others in defeat, and fought for ego, not unity. An ally who never quite treated Americans as equals. And that memory outlived him. When Montgomery died in 1976, aged 88, he took with him one of the most complex legacies of any Allied commander. He had never lost a major battle. He had protected his troops. He had saved armies from collapse. But he had also endangered relationships, undermined joint strategy, and left behind a long trail of frustration among his allies. In war, you can be a tactician and a problem at the same time. And to the Americans who fought alongside him, that's exactly what Montgomery became. Not a villain, not a coward, but a reminder that in coalition wars, personality can win battles or unravel everything. And that leads us to one final uncomfortable question. One that smoldered for decades after the war was over. Did Montgomery's actions sabotage the alliance that saved the world? Or was he just made into a scapegoat by an America too eager to forget their most difficult partner? The answer isn't simple, but it is revealing. Legacy, blame, and the real reason Americans couldn't forgive Montgomery. When the shooting stopped and the flags went up, the world called it a victory. The Allies had defeated Nazi Germany. The cities were rubble. The empires overturned, and history had been changed forever. But for many of the American commanders who fought across Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany especially, those who stood shoulder to shoulder with British troops, the war didn't end in May 1945. For them, the real conflict, the one no one newspaper would ever print, was a quiet, unfinished war of memory. Because long after the bullets fell silent, the bitterness remained. And at the center of all of it was one man, Bernard Law Montgomery. History refuses to settle. Ask any military historian today, British or American, about Montgomery, and you'll get at least two versions of the truth. A brilliant field commander who outmaneuvered the Desert Fox and helped lay the groundwork for D-Day, or an insufferable egotist who derailed Allied harmony, undermined American efforts, and claimed glory he didn't earn. Which version is correct? Maybe both, maybe neither. But what's beyond debate is this. No Allied leader was more respected by the British public and more resented by the American commanders he worked with. To understand why, you have to go past the medals, past the maps, and deep into the psychological fault line that cracked the Allied coalition again and again. Americans weren't just fighting Nazis, they were fighting for validation. When the US joined the war in 1941, its military was untested. Still green, outdated in equipment and doctrine, and entering a battlefield already soaked with British and Soviet blood, Americans weren't just proving themselves to the enemy, they were proving themselves to their allies. The British had stood alone. The Blitz, Dunkirk, El Alamein. To many British commanders, including Montgomery, the Americans were still apprentices playing catch-up. And no matter how many troops the US poured in or how many victories they stacked up, they were never quite treated as equals. For Montgomery, it wasn't personal. For the Americans, it absolutely was. Here's the irony. Montgomery may not have even realized just how badly he was eroding the alliance. To the Field Marshal, everything ran through one simple logic. The plan must be perfect. I will make the plan. Others will follow the plan. It will work. End of story. That mindset won battles. Monty famously never lost a major one, but it also bulldozed relationships. It didn't matter who fought beside him, whether it was Patton driving to Messina or American troops dying in the Ardennes. Montgomery didn't share ownership. He offered praise, sparingly. He protected his own reputation fiercely. And when things went wrong, his finger never pointed at his own chest. The Americans noticed. They didn't need flattery. They didn't even need equal command. But at the very minimum, they needed respect. The patterns were too consistent. Let's look back, just briefly. Tunisia Americans win hard-fought victories. British reports ignore them. Cicely Patton outraces Montgomery to Messina. Monty downplays the importance, praises his own advances. Market Garden Montgomery architects an overconfident, underprepared operation. When it fails, he calls it 90% successful. Battle of the Bulge American soldiers endure impossible odds. Montgomery commands them briefly, then gives himself the credit on live microphones. Over and over again, the achievement was minimized, and the narrative became British-led victory, with American muscle playing support. It was never stated directly, but it was always felt. And after a while, it became impossible to ignore the American fear. Were they just subordinates in a British war? For US commanders who had spent their lives studying George Washington, independence, and military self-determination, the idea of being guided from above by a British field marshal didn't just rankle, it lit a fire. Sorry, it wasn't good enough. Because this wasn't just etiquette, it was legacy. No American army had ever crossed the Atlantic and fought for Europe before. Now they were mobilizing millions, outproducing every nation on Earth, and providing the muscle and strategy for liberating an entire continent. But somehow Montgomery still spoke and acted like victory had to pass through him. That attitude sliced deep. It made brave American generals feel like second-tier partners in a war they had come to win. British historians still defend him. To be fair, Montgomery's defenders are passionate and detailed. Many British historians argue that Montgomery's focus on minimizing casualties was misunderstood by Americans, obsessed with speed. His detailed planning ensured victories without unnecessary bloodshed. American generals, particularly Patton and Bradley, were far more concerned with glory than with strategic prudence, and that many American criticisms were ego-driven responses to Montgomery's superior battlefield record. They point out that Montgomery never lost a decisive engagement, and that his precision likely saved lives over the course of the war. And they're right on some level, but to American commanders, that defense misses the point entirely. It was never just about the plans, it was about partnership. Montgomery could afford to play the long game. He had Churchill behind him. The British press adored him. His legend was already secured from El Alamein. The Americans? They were trying to right their reputation in real time, under fire, one operation at a time. And while Montgomery saw war as a chessboard, the Americans saw it as a team sport, where the scoreboard didn't just include objectives taken, but people acknowledged. Every time a US division was ignored in a report, every time a British staff officer made a suggestion that sounded like a command, every time Montgomery described the Americans like students, not allies. The resentment grew, not because he was wrong, but because he refused to acknowledge how right they were becoming. Eisenhower's lost word. Years after the war, when asked about Montgomery, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, who had seen ego and brilliance from every front, summed it up best. Montgomery possessed undeniable military skill, but he lacked appreciation for the political realities of Allied warfare. His inability to treat partners as equals made him unsuitable for coalition command. It wasn't a condemnation of his talent. It was a verdict on his failure to adapt in a war that relied as much on diplomacy as it did on strategy. And it was that failure, not his cautious tactics, not his clipped British accent, and not even his arrogance that sealed his fate in American memory. The final truth: why the Americans hated Monty. So here it is, the real answer. The Americans didn't hate Montgomery because he was British. They didn't hate him because he was cautious. They didn't hate him because he wanted to win. They hated him because he made them feel like props in a victory they were helping to right. They believed his leadership was rooted in the very mindset they'd fought a revolution to escape. That British wisdom must always lead, while American strength must always follow. And the battlefield couldn't erase that feeling. If anything, it made it worse. The lesson that outlived the war: in years to come, American military doctrine, especially in NATO and joint operations, quietly adapted to the scars Montgomery left behind. Coalitions would require shared command structures. Victory would no longer be claimed by one flag. And future generals would be chosen not just for tactics, but for how well they played with others. Because sometimes, the war inside the alliance is more dangerous than the war outside it. And sometimes, being brilliant isn't the same as being right for the moment. Montgomery's legacy. To the British public, Montgomery remains a hero. That will never change. To Americans, he's remembered for what he refused to become: a partner, a commander who treated his allies who bled with him as equals on the battlefield. In that failure lay the true answer. Why did the Americans hate Montgomery? Because he made them feel like outsiders in a war they were winning. And when history came calling, he took the podium, told the story, and made himself the main character again. If you found this breakdown of Montgomery's legacy insightful, let us know in the comments below. Was he a misunderstood genius or a necessary ego check for the Allies? And don't forget to subscribe, because the untold stories of history are far from over.